Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Researchers seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today we have Alex Bryson, who will discuss the relative importance of the establishment in the determination of job quality. Alex will speak for around 35 minutes, depending on your questions. You may unmute yourself at any time and interrupt him with short questions, however. And then following the presentation, we'll have more time for a longer Q&A. At that time, please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. And when not speaking, please keep your microphones muted. As a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and our YouTube channel. Now to introduce Professor Alex Bryson. Alex is Professor of Quantitative Social Science at University of College London's Social Research Institute. He is also a research fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the IZA Institute of Labor Economics, and the Economic Statistics Center of Excellence. He is editor-in-chief of Industrial Relations, A Journey of Economy and Society, and an editor at the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, Series A, and the Journal of Participation and Employee Ownership. And in a quick look at his Google Scholar page, you'll see that he is one of the most productive people in our field. Without further ado, Alex, the floor is yours.
Kelsey, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to present our work. And I say ours, one of my co-authors, Francis Green, also from UCL, is in the audience today and may wish to want to join in at various points. And the third author is John Forth at City University, also in London. The issue today is the role of the establishment, and establishment throughout this whole presentation is a physical location, a workplace where you're working, distinct from a firm. Firms might have multiple sites across a country or across the world. So we're looking at the role of the workplace specifically in trying to understand variance in job quality. So why do we care about job quality? Well, at the top, it's very much associated with general well-being across populations, not surprisingly perhaps, given that we spent roughly a third of our time in jobs. The big question, however, is how much of the variation in overall job quality is actually accounted for by the workplace that you work in, and how important is this relative to other sources of variation, such as the occupation that you perform or your own employee characteristics. So what we want to do today is provide you with an answer to the question regarding the relative importance of the establishment in explaining various aspects of job quality. So we're not just looking at global overall job quality. We're going to distinguish between pecuniary job quality, pay, earnings, the focus for many economists, but also 6 aspects of non-pay job quality. And I'll also be using overall measures of job quality and an overall additive measure of non-pay job quality. So we'll want to understand the role of the establishment in explaining variance in these things. And then we'll also show you how these different components of job quality, how they correlate with one another at establishment level. Is it that in a workplace that's good on one dimension, it's good on all dimensions? Is a workplace that's bad on one dimension, bad on other dimensions? We'll give you an answer to that. And we'll also tease out the establishment specific component of job quality, having stripped out who works there and the occupations that exist in that workplace. We'll strip them out and we'll have a residual workplace level workplace level job quality. And we'll ask ourselves, if we rank that establishment level job quality from best to worst, what establishment level characteristics explain where an establishment sits along that job quality index? So Is it, for example, small size or large size establishments? Where do they sit in terms of explaining the establishment level variance in job quality? The reason that we're excited about this is that we don't think that this has been done before. We haven't even published the paper yet. It will come out as a discussion paper next week. So your comments and thoughts are very much welcome. And I sent a version of the draft paper to Kelsey, and you're very welcome to receive that either from him or indeed directly from me. So how are we going to do this? We're going to deploy a form of analysis that's called dominance analysis, and I'm going to explain what that is, but it's very, very simple. In fact, what I'm going to do is identify the contribution of various predictors in explaining variance in job quality measures. So many of you will be familiar with running a regression analysis where you have a dependent variable, and in this case, that's going to be job quality, and some explanatory variables. In our case, those explanatory variables come in 4 varieties: who you are, the job that you do, the establishment that you work in, and the year that we identify you. And what I'm going to do is decompose the overall variance in job quality explained by the model. So the model fit statistic is called an adjusted R squared. It tells us the proportion of the overall job quality explained by our model. And I'm going to decompose that into independent components attributable to each set of independent variables. And there I'm going to be focused very much on the establishment role, because that rarely appears in the literature on this. So having done that, what you'll see is I've got pooled data on individual workers, but crucially here we have linked employer-employee data, which means I know which establishment they work in. And in fact, with the data we're using, the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, on average, I have 10 workers per establishment. So I can pull out the establishment component of job quality from that, because I have multiple observations on each workplace from different workers. So I can capture that, what I'm calling here the residual component of establishment job quality, and see how each aspect of job quality at the establishment level is correlated with each other, and then how it's related to establishment observed characteristics. You'll notice, and I think this is a perfectly reasonable thing for you to think about, that our data are not new, 2004 to 2011, and you might want to ask yourself the question, do you think the results that we present today are going to be similar or different some 10, 15, 20 years later? I have no reason to suspect that they will be. In fact, they're quite stable across these 2 periods of time. But it's the reason that we're using those data is what I'm about to present you is rarely available in any data set.
Alex, just a clarifying question.
Sure.
So you have approximately 10 employees per establishment. And who are they? Is this a random sample, or is
Yes,
this?
I will come on to that in
Okay.
the data construction, but essentially what we require of the employer is to provide us with a list of their workers, and then the survey agency randomly picks workers from that list. In the smallest establishments, we'll pick everybody. And then in the larger establishments, we'll pick a 1 in n random sample. And then
Perfect.
we'll reweight the data to account for the nature of that survey design.
Thanks.
So taking you initially straight to the findings, what do we find? Well, where you work explains more of the variance in non-pecuniary job quality than who you are and what you do. So that's, I think, a fairly new finding. How much does it explain? Well, it depends upon the actual job quality variable we're looking at, but anything between 2/5 and 3/4 of the explained variance in a model is attributable to where you work. So we have 6 measures of non-pecuniary job quality at establishment level, and these are indeed highly positively correlated with one another. This suggests that establishments that are good in one aspect of non-pecuniary job quality are good on others. However, the establishment component of earnings is not correlated with establishment non-pecuniary job quality. So there's an outlier here. It's earnings, and we'll come back to that because, of course, there's theory about the relationship between that aspect of job quality, pay, and non-pecuniary components of job quality. Now, when we pull out that residual establishment premia on job quality, we discover that it's correlated with several observed establishment characteristics. I'm not going to show you all of that today, but what I do want you to know is that we find that non-pecuniary job quality is greatest in the smallest establishments in our data. So what do we currently know from the rest of the literature? Well, point 1 in this slide points us directly to the focus of the economics literature, which focuses really primarily on one component of job quality, namely earnings. And this literature has already confirmed that the establishment, the workplace that you work in, accounts for a fairly sizable proportion of total variance in earnings. So it's not just who you are and your human capital, it's actually where you work that accounts for a lot of the variance in earnings levels. And crucially, in the paper I've mentioned by Erling Barth and colleagues, the growth in wage inequality in a country like the United States since the mid-1970s, 2/3 of that is actually accounted for by the workplace that you work in. So we already know this on the earnings front, but what we're going to be filling in here for you is what happens in terms of the establishment's role in explaining variance in the non-wage component of job quality. Now, in fact, you could go all the way back to Richard Lester in the 1950s, who challenged the proposition in economics that really all firms were price takers, and therefore they had no control over wages because they were set in the marketplace. Richard Lester said, no, that's totally untrue. In fact, there's a considerable amount of variance in earnings across employers, even in the same locale, even in the same occupation. So I think that's a really interesting point. We've known that for 70 years, but we've not really looked at that in the context of non-pecuniary job quality. In theory, then, what might happen with the non-wage components of job quality? Well, in terms of earnings, we've already established in the literature there's quite a sizable proportion of that varies across establishments. What might that mean for variance in non-pecuniary job quality? And here in the literature, broadly speaking, there are 2 propositions: the compensating wage differential story, whereby maybe employers aware that workers are trading off perhaps wage and non-wage components of job quality, there might be a negative correlation between the two, as a worker sacrifices some components, say, of non-pecuniary job quality for higher wages. Alternatively, of course, there's the bargaining power hypothesis, whereby workers with high bargaining power get the best of both worlds. They get good job quality in the non-pecuniary and the wage dimension. In fact, in the literature, as my colleague Francis Green has already recently intimated, by and large, in what he's done, finds that there's little correlation between the two overall, but we're going to come back to that at establishment level, something that's not been seen before. Now, the literature, in a lot of which is in sociology on non-pecuniary job quality, focuses on variance at occupational level. So that's the work of people like Mark Williams, who I've cited there. And there's also a literature at the macro level that focuses on employment systems, country level differences in terms of job quality. Again, Francis Green has contributed to that, often with Duncan Galley, who I refer to there. But there's little evidence regarding variance at establishment level. Although, of course, we do know that there's substantial variance at establishment level in things that might affect job quality. What do I mean? Well, management practices. Remember the work by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenem. Bad bosses, Benjamin Arts and colleagues, and worker voice, for example. So we might have some priors that these things might well vary quite substantially across establishments. And indeed, we might even have reason to believe that establishment level variance in non-pecuniary job quality could be even greater than establishment level variance in wages. Why? Well, because they are less tangible and as such harder to signal to prospective job seekers. So what's the data? Kelsey asked. The answer is this workplace employment relations survey. We have it for 2 points in time, and we pool these data, and in everything that we model, we distinguish between 2004 and 2011. We have a dummy variable which identifies which year the data come from. But in fact, when we run the analysis separately for both years, we find very similar results. We account for survey design because what we want to do here is we want to be able to extrapolate to population level. So the data are basically nationally representative of workplaces with 5 or more employees in Britain. Doesn't include Northern Ireland, includes the public and the private sectors. And we have roughly 39,000 employees and just under 3,000 establishments. I'm going to show you in detail in a minute what I mean by job quality in these data. We will have overall 7 job quality domains, 6 of which are non-pecuniary, 1 of which is earnings. And in our analysis, we standardize the scores that we put together so that in each case, each domain has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And then we have 2 summary job quality indices, also standardized. One is for overall job quality, so it's equivalent to adding up the 7 domains, and one which drops the earnings component, which is just about non-pecuniary job quality. Where do the measures of job quality come from? They come from the employee surveys. Where do the establishment level characteristics come from? They come from the human resource manager at the workplace, the person who is responsible for employment relations. The workers also give us information on who they are, their job traits, and what they do. So when I talk about occupation here, I'm talking about 4-digit occupation and a variable which captures whether they have supervisory responsibilities. And also, as a prelude to all of this, we want to get we do a validation exercise of our job quality metrics by looking to see whether they are correlated in the way that we would expect them to be with worker well-being and worker job satisfaction. So these are the job quality components, and these go over the next 3 slides. So pretty lengthy, but I can go through them quickly. First of all, earnings, which is log hourly earnings, and you can see the source question there in the text. Secondly, job prospects. 2 metrics here: perceptions of the individual about their job security, and secondly, their contract type, distinguishing between permanent and temporary jobs.
Alex,
We have yes.
Stop you for a second. The little button at the bottom says you're sharing your screen. Is it possible to hide that so we can read?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
there we go.
There we go. Perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
Done it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Secondly, thirdly, working time quality. Here we're drawing on 4 different metrics. One is working fairly lengthy hours, above 48 hours a week. The second is the extent to which you have working time flexibility in terms of the start and finish of your working day. The third is the availability of flexible working arrangements. And here we know whether people actually avail themselves or not of these arrangements. But what we're capturing here is the availability at the establishment to people like them on things like flexi time, working reduced hours, paid leave for care and emergency and stuff like that. And then fourthly, managers' approaches to non-work responsibilities as understood by the employees. So we ask them, thinking about managers at this establishment, to what extent do you agree or disagree that managers here understand that employees have to meet responsibilities outside of work, so a sort of work-life balance thing. Then we have an autonomy and involvement component. Task discretion, of course, absolutely central to psychologists when they think about job quality. So how much influence the worker has in terms of tasks, the pace at which they do them, the order in which they do them, and so on. Employee involvement, that is the extent to which managers listen to workers when they want to have a say about what happens in their job. Then we have a skill development and utilization component of job quality around training received, managers' approaches to skill development, and then the skill match as perceived by the worker as between their own skills and those required of them in the job. And we also have work intensity. Now here, of course, when you think of the job demands literature, higher job demands, although not in a linear way, higher job demands are perceived to be a negative in terms of job quality. So we reverse code this. So we're talking about the ease of job demands and the pace of job demands. Finally, our final of our 7 components is social environment. So employee perceptions of the way in which management treats the workers fairly, and the creation of a trust-related environment, and of course a very standard one, industrial relations, the climate of employment relations as between managers and employees. And then the final 2 indices here are composite indexes based upon those other metrics. Here I'll skip over the distribution of these different metrics here, but some of them we know very much about. Earnings, for example, skewed in the way we'd see in the standard literature. Other of these metrics we will not have seen in the same way before. So starting, just to show you as a prelude, here we can see a simple pairwise correlation matrix between different job quality components at the level of the worker. And at the bottom here, in the last 2 rows, you can see employees' job satisfaction and their well-being, which is the well-being metric is different from job satisfaction. It's a composite based upon contentment and enthusiasm regarding their job. And what you can see here, broadly speaking, by and large, you see coefficients that are positive and statistically significant most of the time for most of the non-pecuniary job quality components, suggesting that they hang together. That's not quite true for work intensity. You'll see the correlations are lower here and even negative in some areas. But crucially, the one that's a real outlier is the first column, earnings. Those correlation coefficients are small, and some of them are not statistically significant. So earnings does not cohere with non-pecuniary job quality here at the level of the worker. What about the links to job satisfaction and well-being? Well, across the whole of non-pecuniary job quality, you see fairly sizable and statistically significant positive correlations, as you'd expect. One big point here, you see, if you look at job satisfaction, you see a positive correlation with earnings, but the well-being correlation is negative. And that actually doesn't surprise us, because we have a previous paper on this where we show that higher earnings and those workers with higher earnings quite often express lower well-being, which is driven by anxiety and stress linked to the job responsibilities which give them those higher earnings. Now, this is the key component of the estimation procedure that we're going to use, which basically the Yij is the dependent variable, the thing that we're trying to explain, different measures of job quality for individual I in establishment J. And we are going to look at the extent to which variance in that is correlated with these sets of independent variables. So the first set, DEM, that's your demographic characteristics of the employee I in establishment J. And here you can see we've got gender, ethnicity, disability, age, qualifications. The second key set of variables is the job that you do. And this is the 4-digit level standard occupational classification, together with a variable indicating whether the employee supervises other employees. We then have the year that we observe you, and then crucially, a focus of much of our attention, the unique establishment identifiers. So here they are capturing which workplace you actually work in, so the link between the worker and the establishment. In each case, we have beta coefficients from the model, and here basically these variables will give us an explained amount of variance in the job quality that we're looking at. So what we're going to do in the remainder is we're going to take the total share of the variance in job quality that the individual I in establishment J, how much of that is explained by the covariates in the model. And these are the covariates, the demographics, the occupation, the year, and the establishment. And the dominance analysis is simply a way of identifying the contribution of each of these predictors down here, demographics, occupation, year, and establishment, the extent to which they explain the variance in overall job quality. It's an additive decomposition of the adjusted R-squared, which is a standard model fit that you would have for an ordinary least squares estimate. So we've denoted it in the paper, each of these components with XV, so it's just a set of predictors. And the dominance statistic indicates the marginal contribution of, let's say XV is the establishment, to the variance in job quality, and for each possible model in which the establishment could exist. So essentially what we have here is we have 4 different sets of explanatory variable, which means the total number of parameters that we can have in the model with the establishment can go from 0 to 3. You can have establishment on its own, establishment plus demographics, establishment plus occupation, establishment V, and so on. So we run the model each time with each set of possible parameters in it and recover the marginal contribution to the adjusted R-squared associated with that variable of interest. And that's basically what's happening here. So the dominant statistic conditional on each value of L, well, where L is the number of parameters of the model, is basically the sum of the difference between the adjusted R-squared with and without that particular variable. So let's say XV in this case is the establishment, divided through by the total number of models that we have available to us, which here is 4 because we have 4 different parameters. So from that, we can decompose the variance in the model into those constituent parts. Now, the final thing that we do, and if I go back, can I go back, is we take this beta 4, this is the coefficient for the establishment that you work in, and that becomes this estimation at the bottom here, that becomes our dependent variable. So essentially what we're doing here is we're taking the establishment residual, netting out who you are in that establishment and what you do, just capturing the differences across the establishments, and we try and regress them against establishment characteristics, these Z features here. And these things are things like who owns the establishment, what industry is it in, and how big it is. And that can help us understand the observed features of establishments that allow us to get some insights into what lies behind the establishment level variance in job quality. So let's see what all of this looks like. A big table, but fairly straightforward to understand. Let's take earnings. So these are different dependent variables here in this first column. Here's earnings regression. How much of the variance in earnings can we explain in our full model? The answer is 62%. So fairly sizable. Why? Well, because we have the establishment, not just who you are and what you do, but where you work. So it means that 37% of the variance in earnings across all of our workers is unexplained by our model. So when we look to see the contribution of each set of variables, here you can see in this dem column, this is the demographics. What this is telling me is that 14% of all the variance in earnings is accounted for by who you are. Nearly a quarter is accounted for by the occupation that you do, and about a quarter is accounted for by the establishment that you work in. But earnings are unusual. Earnings are unusual because actually demographics really matter quite a lot for earnings variance. But if you go down these other rows, you see that who you are really accounts for very, very little of the non-pecuniary job quality that you face as a worker. What actually matters most is not your occupation. If you look at the column with occupation in it, yes, it counts for something. The big factor is the establishment. If you look at the overall non-pecuniary job quality metric, we can account for about a quarter of it with our model. So most of it, 76%, is unaccounted for. But the biggest explanatory variable, the biggest thing that accounts for the variance, is the establishment you're in. Here in the second half of the table, we've disposed with the unexplained variance. So we're just focusing on decomposing the explained variance. So in earnings, essentially what we see is that the establishment accounts for as much of the variance in earnings as occupation. Both account for about 2/5 of the explained variance in earnings. But on everything else, the real dominant factor is the establishment. So let's take social environment. If you remember, that was about climate and trust and so on. 3/4 of the explained variance, and that comes from the establishment, only about 1/5 from the occupation. So if you look at all items together, the whole of job quality, 2/3 nearly of explained variance in job quality is actually driven by where you work. About 1/3 of it is what you do. Non-pecuniary job quality, the difference is even bigger. 70% of explained variance in non-pecuniary job quality comes from the establishment. About a quarter comes from the occupation, and who you are accounts for very little. We can mess with the model and see how much of the variance in job quality we can explain by changing what we put in the model. So look in this first column here, we just plug in occupation now, what you do. That's a really remarkable result. That accounts for 46% of the variance in earnings alone. It's quite sizable. But it's not that dissimilar if you just put in where you work, 42%. On everything else, you can see that the dominant factor is the establishment. If you just know where a worker works, you can account for 1/5 of their job quality. Yeah. Much lower on occupation only. If you know the establishment they work in and their employee characteristics, about 1/5 of job quality can be explained. So the results that we're finding, which emphasize the importance of the establishment that you work in, are not really driven by which other variables go in the model. What about correlations? This time round, I'm not talking about the individual level. I pulled out the establishment specific component of job quality and looked at the correlation there. And once again, what we see is that on non-pecuniary job quality, establishment level non-pecuniary job quality, all these different metrics are highly positively correlated with one another. But that's clearly not the case with earnings. There's really very little correlation between establishment earnings and establishment non-pecuniary job quality. So if compensating wage differentials and bargaining power are at play, well, it would appear that they're offsetting one another to the extent that really there is little correlation between the earnings that an establishment offers to its workers and the non-pecuniary job quality that the establishment offers to its workers. What about the establishment correlates of the establishment level job quality? Most of the variance in establishment level job quality we cannot explain by observed traits. We do know from the rest of the literature that earnings are positively correlated with establishment size, and we also know that the smallest establishments have the highest non-pecuniary job quality. That's what we find here, and that's what others have found elsewhere in a small literature that bears down on that. We can go into a little bit of detail here. Let's take industry. Industry plays a role in accounting for variance in both pecuniary job quality and non-pecuniary job quality. So, for example, the establishment level variance in non-pecuniary job quality is particularly low in transport and communications. If we look at earnings, it's not surprising to discover that the establishment level variance in that is highest in London and the Southeast. What we didn't know until we ran these analyses is that establishment level non-pecuniary job quality is particularly high in one part of Great Britain, and that's Wales. We don't know why, but that's what we find. If we look at trades union recognition, so that's the extent to which trades unions have a formal role in collective bargaining over pay, not surprisingly, we find that is positively correlated with the unexplained variance in establishment earnings. But equally interesting, it's actually correlated with poorer non-pecuniary job quality. We do some robustness tests. As I've said before, we find similar results when we separate out between 2004, 2011. We add survey more on the survey design. That doesn't make much difference. One important thing to bear in mind, however, is we don't have everything in these data. And one big part of job quality we don't have is the physical environment. We think that maybe the results would be similar, but we don't know that for sure. So to summarize, the establishment is the dominant factor explaining variance in non-pecuniary job quality. It accounts for nearly 3/4 of it. This is true when we look at a different metric, worker well-being. So George Ward at Oxford, for example, has found similar results, not looking at job quality, but looking at worker well-being, almost as if it's a proxy for job quality. The establishment also accounts for a similar amount of variance in earnings, even as occupation. So it's about 2/5 in both cases. It could be that we think that occupation is much more important here, and this is the aspect of job quality where the establishment is playing the smallest role, and it could be that employers are constrained in varying wages by competition or firm level policies in a way that perhaps they're not constrained on other aspects of job quality. But the key policy point from all of this, it implies that establishment level practices or policies regulating them may have a very sizable impact on job quality and the distribution of job quality across establishments. And I don't think that we knew that for sure, not in a formal way, until we ran this analysis. We also see that the establishment level variance in non-pecuniary job quality, these aspects are highly positively correlated. So in an establishment where you're good on one, you're good on others, and conversely, where you're poor on one, you're poor on others. But there is very little sign of compensating wage differentials here because non-pecuniary job quality is not correlated with earnings. Finally, we do find this intriguing result that establishment level non-pecuniary job quality is greatest in the smallest establishments. So whilst their earnings may be lower, their non-pecuniary job quality is higher. Okay, back to you, Kelsey. I'll leave it there. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that you can stop sharing if you'd like. It's really up to you. I think it can facilitate if you wanted to call in people, but I can manage that as well. So that's fine. Unfortunately, Francesco had to leave, but he says it's super interesting, and he had something he had to follow up on. It was a pleasure to hear your talk. So everyone, please feel free to either raise your virtual hands or to write in the chat. And I think I could potentially get us started. So Alex, I'm thinking a little bit about selection and mediators. So when you look at demographics and you control for occupation, you're controlling for part of the way through which demographics could influence job quality. So we have people with higher levels of education are more likely to choose a certain occupation than others. And so I'm also wondering if, the establishment so occupation you could argue is a mediator or a bad control if you were studying demographics, which I know in this case it's a very good control. I wonder to what extent do people select into certain kinds of establishments? So you said that the establishment is not well explained. This, essentially the establishment's contribution is not well explained by other characteristics. Did you look at it as a function of demographics? To what extent do people select into certain establishments?
Yeah. Well, we know from a massive literature using longitudinal linked employer-employee data, of course, that there is very substantial sorting, non-random sorting of workers across establishments. And of course, it goes all the way back to Abab, Kramatz, and Margolis on high-wage workers and high-wage firms. So that's well known. Our data are not particularly well suited to deal with that. What I've shown you today is primarily two cross sections, although there is a very small panel component to it, and we actually have looked at that. So we have looked at the persistence of job quality in the panel of establishments, and what we find is it's fairly persistent between 2004 2011. But you're asking me a slightly different question, Kelsey, which is one that is not addressed at all in this paper. This paper is a fairly static attempt, almost like an accounting procedure, whereby we are decomposing the variance in job quality into four components, which by construction we have argued are independent of one another. What you're saying is, hold on a minute, they're not independent, are they? Workers know, firms signal, and they signal across wage and non-wage components of job quality, and people will queue for those jobs. And if they have knowledge, and there is a literature about this, including a growing literature based upon other data that are better suited to this, things like all the online job search platforms and so on, that workers in their job search will hone in on firms that offer them job attributes that they value. And we also know that different people value different job attributes differently. And so, of course, there is going to be sorting, and we've abstracted away from all of that. So you're quite right to raise the issue in the sense that one must have that in mind when trying to interpret what I've shown you today.
Thank you. I should have said initially, I find it quite compelling what you found, but also I think that this is an interesting component. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of additional questions, so we'll go straight to it. So Chris Hill, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like. And actually, I had a similar question. So what would be the establishment for those who work remotely?
Well, that would be tricky, except for essentially think about the sampling again. Alex Bryson's establishment is 55 to 59 Gordon Square in London. Alex Bryson isn't there as often, perhaps as his employer would like. Indeed, he's at home today and is often working remotely, but that's his establishment. So it's a nice point, Chris, because on the issue of something like physical environment, most of the time, my physical environment is determined by my home setting. It's not actually my office space. And so on that one, there might be quite a big difference between the establishment as felt by the people who are in my 55 to 59 Gordon Square location and me if I'm primarily at home. However, there'll be a whole bunch of other things, I would argue, which are very much shared. So things like how management perceive you, how they respond to your voice, the extent to which you have discretion over your tasks. All of these things, I'd argue, are somewhat common, regardless of whether you're actually located at your establishment or in your home. Of course, I think the point of this is this is a big difference from 2011. Of course, there were many people working at home back then, but now it's grown exponentially. And one of the reasons for it is there are trade-offs between being at work and at home around job quality that people are actually seeking out. And so I think it would be a nice thing to actually explore more, and is one of the things that I'd say may have changed somewhat, especially around physical environment as compared to the data that we have. But remember, we don't even have physical environment in our analysis. Many of the job quality components I'm referring to here, I think, would probably hold whether you're working at home or not.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Yevgeny, you can unmute yourself and ask away. Oh,
yeah, I'm sorry.
now we can.
I had Mike ask in the opposite way. Sorry. As a very interesting presentation, thanks, and quite insightful. Probably I missed just one point. What about the role of diversity in terms of the migration backgrounds of the workforce? Do we account somehow for it?
Yeah, we in our demographics we have ethnicity. We do not know the migrant status of the workers in 2004 and 2011, but we do have ethnicity, so self-reported ethnicity. And I do recognise that we're back to really Kelsey's sorting point, that there are some workers who don't have a great deal of bargaining power in the labour market and will find themselves in very poor establishments. But actually we do in 2011 ask the HR manager what proportion of their workers are migrant workers, and they're quite quite not evenly spread, but there's a sizable proportion migrant workers in many workplaces. I think we could do more on that. It would be nice to have better data on that. We will have better data in the UK shortly, at least in terms of we have something called the migrant workers scan from our social security system, which we're linking to the payroll records of workers. But the point is, we'll only ever get to see earnings in those data. Yeah. What we'll never see is this more nuanced and holistic set of job quality metrics, which you can only really get by running surveys of workers. Administrative data have very little to say about them, and that's where the problem arises. I think for many countries, the data are just not there a lot of the time.
Yeah, thank you. My concern was actually that probably after Brexit, this diversity of backgrounds kind of decreased, so that might have impacted the outcomes. Yeah, I got your key message that basically it's a survey and probably this question is not yet in the survey. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. We have a question from Chiara, who asks whether or not you account for the industry in the, I guess this would be the initial analysis, because you regress the, as I recall, establishment on industry. But
that's right. So actually in cross-section, we have multiple workers per establishment, but the establishment fixed effect, which is the establishment residual, that is collinear with industry. Yeah. So the establishment identifier captures everything about the establishment, but then we pull that out of our first stage regression and then regress it against the observed establishment characteristics. And at that point, industry does come into the equation. And it's true to say that industry variance does matter in explaining which industry the establishment belongs to, matters in explaining variance in job quality across establishments. And I gave one small example, transport and communications, which does have a number of challenges, was particularly low on non-pecuniary job quality. And of course, again, on the wages front, it goes back to the literature, Larry Summers and so on inter-industry wage differentials. We find aspects of that as well. But the overall, it's not really accounting for a lot of the variance in establishment level job quality, but it accounts for some.
Thanks. Please feel free to raise your hands or ask in the chat. I would continue. Alex, I imagine you have so much information here. You could break out the various components. And you alluded to some components of job quality are more visible than others, and earnings being the best example. And that may be why unions are maybe positively correlated with earnings, but not with other components of job quality. So it seems like, did I get that right? And then
no, the union stuff is fascinating, and Francis and I have worked on this before. I don't know if Francis wants to say anything about this, but essentially, pay is always in the utility function of trades unions when they're bargaining on behalf of their members. It's a key component of any bargaining arrangement. The extent to which non-wage components are is there's some dispute. So the idea here would be that in an ideal world, the union is using its bargaining power, which derives from its ability to strike, to negotiate on behalf of its members to improve both pecuniary and non-pecuniary components of job quality. And indeed, oftentimes you'll see in the literature, members are complaining about the extent to which the union has been successful on things like work-life balance, on skill formation and skill development. And unions have been responding in recent years by trying to up their game in those dimensions. But it could be, and here we've got some theory, there are sort of two worlds. World number one, which I would call the right to manage model, whereby an employer accepts the union's role in bargaining over wages, but then, conditional on the union wage, sets all other terms and conditions, including employment levels. Option two, which is a bit like efficient wage bargaining, the union is involved in the whole package, at which point the employer and the union settle at some efficient solution, which is a trade-off between wages and non-wage components. It could be that even in these data, unions are essentially prioritizing wages over and above other things. We've shown in a paper recently for the United States that unions do indeed bargain over employment as well. And so we've shown that unions, for example, reduce what we call underemployment, scenarios in which workers want more hours than they're receiving. Compared to a non-union environment, that happens less often. So there are trade-offs going on, but I will conclude from this that whether it's because the union is more focused on wages or whether it's because the employer desists from bargaining over non-wage components, or it's easier, as I think you're implying, Kelsey, to contract around wages because they're observable. Unions seem to do a good job there, better than in other aspects of job quality, which I think is arguably part of the challenge that unions face.
There's really so much that can be done here. And we've got another comment in the chat.
Yes, is it repeated? Alas and alack, if only. It's very expensive, and I've been involved with people in the British government for some time trying to get it redone, but we're nowhere near there yet at the moment. The whole world has moved towards administrative linked employer-employee data based upon tax records and benefit records. My plan, if it works out in the long run, is to get that infrastructure in place in the UK. It may be there where Kelsey is in Luxembourg, and in many of the countries that you guys are in, it's not there in a readily usable form by researchers in the UK at the moment. But once we have that, our plan is to supplement that infrastructure of administrative data with surveys of workers and employers nested within that longitudinal linked employer-employee framework, which will bring back a new modern version of the Workplace Employment Relations Survey. But we're nowhere near that yet. So we are very much hamstrung by how old these data are. The question, however, is the extent to which you think there's anything to be learned from these older data. And I take the points some people have mentioned today: working from home, migration, Brexit. The world does change. And so one needs to be cognizant of that. But what we do find here is an order of magnitude, the role of the establishment in understanding and at least explaining variance in job quality, which we haven't seen hitherto, and I suspect would still be there today.
We have perhaps the last question, just as we hit 6, unless you have more time, Alex, although if there's more questions coming in. So Young Wang Song asks, or makes comments really about the R-squared and how the adjusted R-squared cannot be interpreted as the percent of the variation of the dependent variable. The adjusted R-squared can sometimes be negative, whereas the R-squared is constrained between 0 and 1.
Okay, well, basically the reason why it's probably optimal to use the adjusted R-squared is that helps us account for the number of parameters in the model. But actually, we've run it with R-squared and adjusted R-squared, and it doesn't make a blind bit of difference to the results. So we went for one rather than the other. And the reason that we've gone for the adjusted R-squared is that in the course of the paper, we show some variance of the model. And the variance of the model involve an increase or a reduction in the parameters. And really, to allow people to compare across those models, one needs to use an adjusted R-squared.
Okay, very much. Thank you very much. I think I would just make one last comment and just say, I think it is very good news that the establishment plays such a large role in, especially compared to demographics, because in my mind, it means that you have more room for adjustment, for policy to play a role, which, as we talked offline, is something that we're particularly interested in here, is what can policy do. So I take your results quite optimistically, and thank you for the presentation. If you have
Thanks
any
for
final
having me.
comments. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think picking up on that last point, Kelsey, you're absolutely right. It could well be that the reason that we explain so little of the establishment level variance in job quality is that it's around things like the quality of management itself, the nature of the bosses, that, you know, all the things I was talking about at the outset, which are quite hard to grasp even with these, you know, even with these fairly granular data. So I do agree with you that there could be good news here. What it's implying to me is, since there's such a lot of across establishment variance in job quality, there is ambit for maneuver on the part of employers. It's not simply, things are not determined simply by the job that you're doing or the marketplace and competition squeezing out job quality. So employers should take that away and have a think about it, think how they can leverage job quality in being profit maximizing in their own space.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I think we can close there. Chris, I see you just joined and you're unmuted. Did you have a question or? Oh,
Whoops.
mute.
No, sorry, that was a mistake. I'm also, looks like I'm an hour late, am I?
Unfortunately, yes. But Alex has graciously said we can share the paper and we'll have a recording soon. So with that, I think I'll close. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.